If you're still an active Division player, then by now you've probably heard about the striker changes that are coming to the game soon with patch 1.8.3. To sum it up real quick, in case you missed it, the set has received a slight nerf to its healing part. Each stack will soon be worth 0.01% of max health per second instead of 0.02%, but the healing is still increased by 0.05% for every 3000 stamina. So in reality, you're not really going to feel this nerf at all, but then the big part, the big change that the developers implemented to the gear set is that whenever a player is in the Dark Zone, Last Stand, or Skirmish, the healing will be further reduced down. It doesn't say by how much. And players will also only gain 1 stack per landed bullet instead of 2. And that's the big part, I guess. The idea that the developers have is that this will balance the gear set separately for PvE and PvP. In PvE, aside from a very small healing nerf, the set will mostly be unaffected. While in areas where PvP is enabled, the healing is reduced and the stacks are much harder to gain and also to keep when you're already at high amounts, because the stacks are still reduced by 2 per second. Now, I'm very happy that this change is coming to the game and that the developers are trying this out, not because I think that this change is good. In fact, I believe that this is a very bad way to implement it, and I'll talk about that soon. But I'm happy that the developers are trying this because the developers have said on State of the Game that separate PvE and PvP balancing is something that they're also looking to do for the Division 2. And by changing this one set in the Division 1, they can get some early feedback, see how it goes, and then, they're basically taking Striker as a test subject for the Division 2 in this case, which I am completely fine with, because the way I see it, patch 1.8.3 could have only gone one of two ways anyway. Either Striker got a very small nerf and it still remains the most dominant set, changing essentially nothing about the game, or the set would have been nerfed into the ground, making it near useless for PvP, which then would instantly bring back a lot of Nomad and Predator to the meta for PvP. The game needs a lot more than a few tweaks to Striker to bring a properly balanced experience, so no matter what the developers would have done with Striker this patch, it would not have mattered much to the hardcore PvP players anyway. The game would have basically remained in the same state. It's just that, we have Striker now and we might not have Striker afterwards. That's the only thing. So I'm actually very happy that they're experimenting with this gear set and testing stuff out for the second Division game. But with this separate PvE and PvP balancing that they did, it opens up a lot of opportunity to discuss the way that they did things and why it is, in my opinion, far from perfect. I really dislike the idea that players suddenly have less healing or gain less stacks when they play a certain game mode or when they are on a certain part of the map. First of all, of course, we have Mr. Farmer Joe here, who just goes into the Dark Zone to clear landmarks. He doesn't really interact with other players and tries to avoid PvP like the plague. This guy will now permanently be affected by the PvP nerf when playing in the Dark Zone, even if he's just doing landmarks. That can be a minor complaint for somebody, but it's going to affect some people. But also, most importantly, I think this whole idea where a gear set isn't as effective or works differently depending on what part of the map you're on, I think that kind of breaks the universal building freedom that players have with the Division. Don't get me wrong, with this one example for this one gear set, I don't think it's such a big deal. I don't think it's that bad. But they're looking to implement things like this for the Division 2. Say we add this system to all the gear sets for the Division 2, to where every gear set now acts differently depending on whether you're playing in the open world or whether you're playing in the Dark Zone or whether you're playing some PvP game mode. Doesn't that take away some of what makes the character building in a Division good and cool? Doesn't that take away some of the freedom? Don't get me wrong, separate PvE and PvP balancing is important, but in 90% of the cases, I think that all is required is just adding a couple of multipliers to certain weapons or stats. In a Division 1, we already see this a lot. We have headshot damage and enemy armor damage, which are very strong stats. They work both in PvE and in PvP. But both are ultimately a bit weaker in PvP due to a certain multiplier. The same goes for the damage on the weapons and the skills. We have a multiplier that goes through it before it actually damages other players. These weapons or stats, they are in full effect no matter where you are on the map. Stats like these, they always work the same way no matter on what build you get them. It is just that when you interact with other players, they can be less or more impactful depending on the multipliers that the developers added on these stats. And I think that that's the right way to balance PvE and PvP. The problem that the developers probably faced with Striker is that we're dealing with player stacks and healing that's based on your own health, which is a lot different than dealing damage. And then you combine that with, of course, the Dark Zone, which is a PvE VP area. We have both PvE and PvP in there. So, how do you balance that? Sure, you can make it so that if you shoot a player, you only get 1 stack, and if you shoot an NPC, you get 2 stacks. And you could reduce the healing from Striker as soon as a player enters PvP combat, which then would still allow him to get the full benefit of the Striker healing when he's just doing landmarks, when he's not shooting at another player. That is something that the developers could have done, and yes, the game can recognize the differences between PvE combat and PvP combat. Just look at the Dark Zone checkpoint doors. You can enter those when you're in PvE combat, but not when you're in PvP combat. So, there is something that the developers could have done with that. But then still, what if you're in the Dark Zone and a player stacks up on NPCs before shooting another player, getting a lot of stacks before the fight starts? Or what if mid-combat he goes to a landmark and then shoots some NPCs to get some more stacks? Would that be a bad mechanic to have in the game? Would that be unfair? I don't really think so, but I think, some people might disagree with me. They think that something like that should not be in the game. The bottom line is, the point that I'm trying to get across is that I believe that the PvE and the PvP balancing is best separated, is best done when players only notice a difference the moment that they shoot or get shot by another player, and not when they enter a specific area or game modes. That just feels a little bit weird to me. I don't really like how that's implemented. But to further go on that, because this isn't really the only point that I wanted to get across with this video, because ultimately the way that the developers changed Striker, the reason why they did it like this, is because the developers didn't want to nerf Striker for PvE because they fear a backlash that the community might have if they were to do so. The Division has definitely had a past of nerfing certain weapons, talents, or gear sets because they seemed too strong in PvP, which then also affected the PvE players. But I think it is also extremely important for us, as the players, as the community, to stay honest with ourselves and with the developers and ask ourselves the question, isn't Striker also a bit too strong in PvE at the moment? I get it, right? You farmed the global event, you got your 6-piece Striker, and you want to feel powerful, but just for a second, let that go and compare Striker to other classified gear sets for PvE. Does anybody really use Predator, Nomad, Deadeye, Final Measure, Firecrest, Lone Star, D3? Okay, sure, there are going to be some people out there that use these sets for PvE, but I think we can all widely agree that Striker, with the enemy armor damage, the easy stacks, the healing, the stability, Striker is by far the most versatile set in the game and the strongest one out there, not only for PvP, but also especially for PvE. Getting to wave 120 in resistance? Yeah, we did that running 3 Strikers and a healer. Speedrunning incursions? You're best off doing that with 3 Strikers and a healer. And I'm not just speaking for myself here, by the way, but also for others. I see a lot of other players also play this way. One of the best speedrunners for PvE in the Division, his name is Kantian. I think that's how you pronounce it. He has a channel, he uploads a lot of speedruns for the Division, and he almost always uses Striker. If he plays in a group, his team composition is always 3 Striker and a healer. Everywhere you look, PvE players are mostly running Striker. And there's a reason for that, because it's by far the most versatile and best set in the game. So really, if we ask ourselves the question, is Striker balanced for PvE? I don't think the answer to that is yes. Would it really be that bad if Striker received a global nerf? I don't think it would be that bad. I think it would open up a lot of other builds to also be just as good in PvE. But the moment that the developers try to tune Striker back down, it will receive a massive backlash from the community. Oh, I farmed my Striker for 20 hours and now you're nerfing it? Oh, shit, developers. That's sort of the knee-jerk reaction you can expect at this point. And I feel that this has been the case for a lot of things in the past as well, at least for the Division. Usually when something got nerfed because it was deemed too strong in PvP, such as, for example, the old G36 when it just came out. That weapon was without a doubt, without any discussion possible, also the strongest weapon by far in PvE. A lot of players complained that it ruined the PvP balancing, and thus the developers dialed it back down, but they dialed it back down for PvE as well. Which was the right thing to do, because if only one weapon or one gear set is at that insane power level, leaving everything else in the game behind, well, then that one weapon or gear set is simply too strong and needs to be tuned down. it was done with the G36, and I think the best move would be to also do it with the Striker gear set in PvE right now. There's also, of course, the argument that I see a lot where people just say, what if we just buff everything else? Which I see that a lot actually, but I also facepalm when I see it because that doesn't really work. Because let's say that a certain weapon is 20% stronger than the rest, but the community gets really, really mad if the developers nerf it. So because the developers don't want to piss off the community, they increase all the other weapons by 20% as well. And then the game is too easy, so the developers also increase the NPC health and damage by 20% to go with it, which then results in the exact same thing as if they just nerfed the one weapon right away. You just word it in a different way, and it takes a lot more effort and time. It's the same as when a developer said they were buffing body shot damage instead of saying that they were nerfing headshot damage in patch 1.6. It's a different wording. You use buff instead of nerfing to try and not piss people off, but the result is essentially the same in the end. So really, what I think we need to do is get away from the idea that the developer should never nerf anything, as it puts them in unnecessary difficult positions where they have to go through big loopholes as they're doing with the Striker change right now, instead of just coming out and saying, hey, you know, Striker's a bit too powerful, both in PvE and in PvP. We're going to dial it back down a little bit to promote build diversity. Honestly, if they did that, it would be much healthier for the game, but they can't do that because the community will backlash a lot when they do that. As I just said, oh, I just farmed for 30 hours. I finally got my Striker. I want to be OP and powerful. Yeah. You can't nerf it now. People need to get out of that one-dimensional mindset and think about what is better for the game as a whole. I see everybody always talking about how great the Division community is, how tight it is, and how we're so interactive with the developers and friendly. But the moment that some of the favorite weapons or gear sets need to be tuned down a little bit in favor for making the game better overall, we start condemning the developers and call them every word in the dictionary, which has now resulted in them giving us this wash list of a description on the gear set in hope to balance the gear set in PvP while not pissing off everybody else playing PvE on easy mode with this gear set, in hope to avoid the backlash. And I think that's kind of pathetic. We really can't do better than this. So yeah, to sum it up, I think that separate PvE and PvP balancing could be done a lot better. And in the cases where it can't be done a lot better than this, I think we should also ask ourselves the question, isn't this item or isn't this gear set also a bit too strong in PvE? If we're being honest with ourselves, you know, isn't it a bit too strong? Anyway, that's just some food for thought there. Let me know if you agree with the change that the developers did. Maybe you completely disagree with me. And if you have anything to add to the discussion, well, you know where to find me. As always, I'll see you guys later. Or, like they say in the Netherlands, zie je later.